right. Well, welcome. My name is Rachel Seidensticker. I'm the COO of Taxel Resources, and I'm here with my brother, the magnificent CEO of Taxel Resources. And we are here to talk with you today about redeemable deeds. We actually did a nice long interview on tax deeds. So if you get a chance, go out to our podcast, Taxel Insiders, and you'll get to learn more about deeds and what that means. But we're taking a spin on it and talking about redeemable deeds today. So let's dig into it, Brian. Let's talk about redeemable deeds. How do redeemable tax deed states work? And how do they differ from the traditional liens and deeds? Because they're kind of a little mix, right? So,
yeah, and I guess it's attempt to simplify the. We could say every state has their own process. In reality, there's 50 different types of sales out there, one for each state because they're governed by state statute. But in an attempt to simplify that, we kind of boil it down to liens and deeds, right? Those are two the opposite ends of the spectrum. And then, of course, there's always these weird middle ground, and you argue forever: is this technically a lien sale or is it a deed sale? And finally said, nah. We didn't coin the term, but let's call it a redeemable deed, right? So it's a deed you're buying. You attend the auction with the intent of owning the real estate, but it does come with a redemption period with it, right? So that's the redeemable deed, or redeemable part of the deed auction itself is knowing there's a redemption period. And a good example of this would be Georgia or Texas. Those are two of the more popular redeemable deed auctions or states that have auctions today.
Okay, so I mean that makes sense. Hence the redeemable, as you say. Is there a standard time frame for that redemption period, or is it vary as well?
Yeah, it varies, right? So the way we define redeemable deed is the intent of going to that auction is it to purchase the real estate or purchase the lien, right? So that comes with lots of room for interpretation. Like Georgia is a 1 year and a day, right, redemption period before you start what's called a barment process, and then you have to go through quiet title, and then eventually you'll have a marketable title deed, but that might be 18 months after the auction. In Texas, it's a 6-month redemption period, right? But they also have this, if it's a homestead property, it could be 2 years, right? So just knowing which ones are homestead versus which ones are not homestead properties is and knowing current information for that is very critical in Texas. It may not matter in other states. Quite frankly, I don't know if that's a nuance in Georgia or not. I guess what are some other examples would be there are some auctions that some would call lien auctions. Technically, they're called commissioner sales in Indiana. And granted, the starting bid is much lower than most deed and redeemable deed auctions, but people are attending that auction. It's got a 120-day redemption period to it, and so people are attending those auctions with the intent of owning that real estate, not necessarily making the return on the lien. So we at Taxel Resources call those redeemable deed auctions. Those would be kind of three of the examples. But I guess the longer answer, or maybe shorter answer, would be every state has different rules that you have to follow: redemption period, what you have to do during, after the auction, etc. So there's not a one definition catches all, unfortunately.
Yeah, which is for all sale types, right? So
yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Well, and you noticed, or you mentioned that kind of redemption period, and if I can add just a little bit, because I know that there's, as you kind of touched on, there's noticing requirements that sometimes have to happen during that redemption period that is a little different than some of the others, especially deed states specifically. So, well, I guess tell me, is there a way that investing in redeemable deeds is maybe, I'm going to use the word better, but is there some bonuses or some positives to invest in a redeemable deed state versus maybe a deed state? And can you kind of expand on what those bonuses might be?
Well, I'll say I don't know if I can answer that directly, right? Is because every state, every process, every deed type kind of has its positives and negatives, and there's lots of different ways to approach it. maybe look at it as if you target really nice properties in redeemable deed states, right? And typically these redeemable deed states have significantly higher interest rates or penalties, I guess they call them, right? So in Georgia, it's 20%, right, for the first 12 months, and then another 10% added on to it after that first year. So it's a pretty attractive return, right? But if your goal is to get that return, if you target, I'll say, lower end properties that are in further disrepair, the chance of somebody redeeming that during the redemption period is significantly lower compared to if you target very high end properties where the interest level is there that somebody's going to do what they can in order to redeem that property, right? So you can basically pursue either model in redeemable deed states, whether you want to own the property or not. You just have to know what you're after and how to target it, right? So I don't know. I can't expressively say that there's an advantage to redeemable deeds over everything, right? It's just it can be an advantage if you target the right thing and you have the right model. But it's the same way for lien auctions. You can be an advantage to go to lien or buying liens if you've got the right model. It can be an advantage of buying deeds if you've got the right model. It all depends on what your model is, what your goal is.
I like it. And I guess just for sake of mentioning it, since there's not that many, there's really only 6 states that practice the redeemable deed concept. Delaware, Georgia, Hawaii, South Carolina, Tennessee, and Texas. And then, of course, you mentioned Indiana, which has one of their sales is a redeemable deed type, but of course it can be mixed as a type of lien sale. So there's a little bit of gray area there. We just happen to call them redeemable deed states. So I just thought it would be good for everyone to know there's not that many of these states out there. So I think that lends itself to be unique. Would you agree?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And yeah, so it's definitely unique.
Yeah, sorry about that. I guess because of that, what do you feel like the competition level is like in redeemable deed states? Do you think there's any sort of difference in comparison to the other types of sales?
Well, how do you define, competition, right? It's probably better to, there's certainly something to be said of there's probably less what I'll call institutional level money at the redeemable deed auctions and the deed auctions. And what I mean by that is the funding mechanism for liens, right? There, you can, right? And maybe we have a whole separate episode about this, but you can get funding for buying tax liens, right? From a bank, traditional bank, right? Whether it's a bank you have a relationship with, there is a proven model for banks in that space for liens, right? There is proven model, right, for real estate once you have insurable title, right? There's less funding options for anything that is in the middle, right? And that's kind of where redeemable deeds and tax deeds before title insurance kind of fall, right? So with that in mind, right, so you're not going to be competing, typically, you're not going to be competing with the funds that are backed by a $300 million line of credit, right, through a bank, right? So you're not going to have that type of competition traditionally. That doesn't mean that things aren't going to be bid up and be competitive, right? So you're still going to have lots of smaller investors, and if the property's only worth $50,000, you only need 2 people with $50,000 in order to bid that up and be competitive. So that happens. Now, so what we have found is there's the advantage more comes from the format of the auction. There's less competition, and we see it in data all the time. There's less competition in live auctions than there is from online auctions because online auctions opens it up to the world. And so live auctions are going to have they're going to have a better return overall. Now, there's certainly exceptions to that. And so the other end of it is how rural is that auction or that county, right? So population centers like Texas, Dallas, San Antonio, Houston, Austin, right? There's going to be a lot more investors at those auctions. Same with Georgia, the Atlanta metro area, or Chatham, which is the county of Savannah, Georgia, I guess is the city there. You're going to have a lot more competition at those auctions compared to you go outside in the middle of nowhere. If there isn't even more than one bidder at that auction, that's a possibility, right? Where there's nobody else at that auction, right? But you also, what's the value of that property? Probably significantly lower than it is in those metro markets, right? So To say that it's better, to pursue redeemable deeds versus anything else doesn't really hold true. But there's certainly ways that you can reduce your competition if that's your goal. But you're gonna basically be giving up or getting one advantage, but maybe a disadvantage in some other way in doing that.
Yep. Yeah, that makes sense. And I guess to put a little plug out there, we have a pretty extensive results ebook available for people going out to our website. And that would give you, Brian touched on, bid rates and where things are, what they're selling for and so forth. And that gives you a nice broad overview of what to expect. And you can really see how bid rates are different in more rural counties than they are in those higher metropolitan areas, like you mentioned. So head out to taxsaleresources.com because it's there. It's an ebook that you can sign up for. So a little plug there, just a small one.
Shameless plug for us.
Shameless plug for it. Yeah. So you mentioned also financing and again, just kind of gravitating on our financing program and how redeemable deed states work within our financing program. I know you mentioned larger hedge funds able to go out and get, the multi-millions of dollars through, semi non-traditional financing. And then once you have a deed, you actually can go and get traditional bank financing. So how do these redeemable deed states work with our financing program specifically?
Yeah, I guess we're trying to fill that void, right? Is funding options are far and few between for new investors coming into deeds and redeemable deeds, right? Deeds meaning those that don't have title insurability yet. Is probably a better way to put it. And so we're attempting to fill that gap. Now there's been years of us researching how the heck you do that, because in most cases you can't put a mortgage on those. You can't, so you essentially, the way our funding works is you as the investors are still going about buying that deed and redeemable deed, right? And then you're going to sign that deed or redeemable deed over to us during the term, right, of that funding period. And then you as the investor have the right to purchase that redeemable deed back, right, down the road, whether you're paying a monthly payment for that right or you are building that into the ultimate repurchase price, right? There's different ways that we structure those programs, but our goal is to enable you, if you've got a successful model and you know what you can buy stuff for, and all your only limitation is capital, then that's exactly what our program is designed to do, is provide that capital so you can go scale your successful model. At a very high level, that is how it works, right? So different states have different terms, right? Whether you want a monthly payment or not, all of that kind of are knobs that we can turn to find a structure that works best for you as the investor. But we want to be the source of capital for successful investors in the redeemable deed and deed space. Like you said, between the lien, where you can find a bank, and between having insurable title, that kind of gray space is where we want to work with you as the investor in.
Yeah. Great. Awesome. Well, any further, I guess, top 3 takeaways that you would give investors for investing in redeemable deed state specifically?
Well, I say this probably every time, but understanding how your state works, right, and including talking to an attorney in that state, even if you got to pay for a couple hours, it is highly valuable and ultimately cheap education compared to the harder lesson you'll learn by not talking to them and just going in blind, right? And then also understanding what you have to do throughout the process of that redeemable deed or deed in order to get insurable title, because that does vary, right? And understanding, for example, Texas, the nuances of if it is a homestead property having to wait 2 years versus 6 months, it's a big difference, right? So understanding those little differences, and then like we've talked about over and over and over again, just doing your research, knowing that what you're buying and underwriting it correctly. Is the structure there? Is it not, right? Are there other liens? How many owners are there on record that ultimately have to be notified? All of that ultimately plays into whether you're going to make money on that purchase or not.
Yeah. Well, and it all comes back to, I think you've mentioned this several times, what's your model? So if we go back to, you're bidding on, if you're in a redeemable deed state and you're bidding on the high priced single family residential, and you're banking on it probably redeeming, you're pretty safe obviously on that one. And if you do end up with it, it's a pretty safe purchase. But being more careful on any of those lower valued properties, and if you're looking at getting the deed, do that extra due diligence, buy those extra reports, take those extra steps. So awesome. Well, Brian, I think that wraps us up for Redeemable Deeds. Thank you so much.
Nope, thank you. Good luck, everybody.